The wealthy residents always ignored the black boy walking their cliffs. But when their beloved billionaire stumbled near the edge, what this boy did made them all fall silent. The sun was setting over La Jolla Cove when Michael first noticed something wrong. His worn sneakers scraped against the rough rocks as he made his way to his usual spot. The rubber soles so thin he could feel every ridge and crack beneath his feet. The 13-year-old's t-shirt clung to his dark skin, damp from the walk up from the bus stop. "Just a little longer," he muttered, checking the cracked screen of his phone. 6:47 p.m. Mom wouldn't be home for another hour, and the twins were safe with Mrs. Rodriguez next door. The ocean crashed against the cliffs below, sending up sprays of white foam. Michael sat down on a flat rock, letting his legs dangle over the edge. From here, he could see the whole cove, the pristine beaches, the million-dollar homes perched on the bluffs, and the expensive cars crawling along the coastal road. His grandmother used to bring him here to fish. "You see those waves, Michael?" she'd say, her voice gentle but firm. "They've been hitting these cliffs for millions of years. That's what makes them strong. All that pressure, all that time." The memory made his throat tight. She died 4 months ago, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. Now he came here alone, watching the sun sink into the Pacific while trying not to think about the past due notices piling up on their kitchen table. A cool breeze carried snippets of conversation from below. Wealthy residents walking their dogs, tourists taking photos, kids his age carrying surfboards and laughing. None of them ever looked up to where he sat. To them, he was invisible, just another shadow on the cliffs. His phone buzzed. Mom's face appeared on the cracked screen. "Michael, are you still at the cliffs?" He could hear the worry in her voice. "Yeah, Mom, I'm being careful. The landlord came by again." She paused, and he heard the familiar sound of her suppressing a cough. "We need to talk when I get home." Michael's stomach clenched. "How bad?" "We'll figure something out, baby. We always do." Another pause. "Just be home before dark, okay?" "Okay, Mom." The call ended, and Michael stared at the darkening sky. 3 years ago, before his dad left, they'd lived in a different neighborhood, had a different life. Now his mom worked 2 cleaning jobs, and he spent his afternoons watching his younger siblings or sitting on these cliffs, wondering how things had gone so wrong. Movement caught his eye, a figure emerging from one of the largest houses on the bluff. Even from this distance, Michael recognized the white hair and expensive clothes. Mr. Frederick Thompson, the billionaire everyone called the Saint of San Diego because of his charitable donations to the city. Michael had seen him on the local news, heard his name mentioned in reverent tones at school board meetings when they announced new computers or sports equipment funded by the Thompson Foundation. But something was different today. Mr. Thompson wasn't walking with his usual purpose. His steps were uncertain, wandering. He moved closer to the edge of his property, where the manicured lawn gave way to the natural cliff face. Michael frowned. The old man was alone, no security, no family members, no caretakers. That wasn't normal. He'd overheard his mom talking to Mrs. Rodriguez about Mr. Thompson's condition, how the great philanthropist was starting to forget things, getting confused. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cliffs. Michael should head home. He knew he should. But something kept him rooted to his spot, watching as Mr. Thompson took another unsteady step toward the edge. A gust of wind whipped around the cliffs, strong enough to make Michael grab the rock beneath him. From his higher vantage point, he saw Mr. Thompson stumble, one foot sliding on the loose gravel. Michael's heart jumped into his throat. The old man was too close to the edge. Way too close. "Hey," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind and waves. "Mr. Thompson." But the elderly man didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he took another step forward, his expensive shoes crunching on the rocks. His white hair glowed in the dying sunlight, making him look almost ghostly against the darkening sky. Michael pushed himself to his feet, his worn sneakers finding purchase on the familiar rocks. His heart pounded as he watched Mr. Thompson sway dangerously close to the drop-off. The decision hit him like a physical force. He could stay where he was, safe but invisible, or he could try to help. But helping meant revealing himself, meant having to explain what a black kid from Logan Heights was doing up here among the mansions and luxury cars. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes being strong means doing the right thing, even when it scares you. Mr. Thompson took another step. Michael started moving. The sun sank lower, casting everything in deep orange and purple shadows. From somewhere below, waves continued to crash against the cliffs. A seagull cried out overhead, its call mixing with the sound of Michael's footsteps as he scrambled across the rocks, praying he wouldn't be too late. Behind him, his phone buzzed again in his pocket, probably his mom, wondering where he was. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Mr. Thompson was one wrong step away from disaster. The old man swayed again in the wind, and Michael's heart nearly stopped. "Please," he whispered, picking up speed. "Just don't move. Please don't move." Up ahead, Mr. Thompson turned slightly, as if hearing something. But his movement brought him even closer to the edge, and in the fading light, Michael could see that the old man's eyes were unfocused, confused. Time seemed to slow down. The waves crashed below. The wind howled around them. And Michael ran, his worn sneakers finding familiar holds in the rocks, moving faster than he ever had before. He was almost there. Almost. Earlier that day, Michael had found the eviction notice taped to their front door. The paper was stark white against the peeling blue paint, impossible to miss. He'd snatched it down before the twins could see it, crumpling it into his backpack before unlocking the door. "Race you to the kitchen," 7-year-old Marcus shouted, pushing past him with Maya close behind. "Hey, careful," Michael called after them. The twins' backpacks lay abandoned in the narrow hallway, and he picked them up automatically. The routine was so familiar he could do it in his sleep. Bags by the table, snacks for the twins, homework spread out on the scratched kitchen table. His phone vibrated, a text from his mom, blood pressure acting up. Working late at the Petersons. Leftovers in fridge. "Love you." Michael's jaw clenched. She'd been getting these headaches more often, but they couldn't afford the medication the doctor prescribed. Not with rent already 2 months behind. "Michael, I'm hungry," Maya announced, pulling at his sleeve. Her braids were coming loose. He needed to ask Mom to redo them soon. Okay. He pulled out bread and peanut butter. "But homework first, remember?" Marcus groaned from the living room. "But Power Rangers is on." "Homework," Michael said firmly, using what the twins called his mom voice. He pulled out the eviction notice while they grudgingly got their books out. The words jumped out at him. 72 hours to vacate. His hands shook slightly as he made the sandwiches. 3 days. They had 3 days to come up with 2 months, rent, or find somewhere else to go. But where? Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment was too small, and all their other relatives lived out of state. After getting the twins settled with their homework, Michael grabbed his laptop, a refurbished model from 3 years ago that barely worked anymore. He opened Craigslist, searching for part-time jobs. Anything would help: lawn mowing, car washing, grocery delivery. 2 hours later, he had submitted 12 applications. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, and the twins were getting restless. "Can we go to the park?" Marcus asked, math homework finally complete. Michael checked the time. 4:30 p.m. "Not today, buddy. I need to run some errands. Mrs. Rodriguez is watching you until Mom gets home." He grabbed his backpack and the wrinkled job applications he'd printed out. The local businesses around La Jolla Cove sometimes hired kids for odd jobs. Maybe if he asked in person. The bus ride took 40 minutes. Michael spent it rehearsing his pitch, trying to sound older, more responsible. But at the first shop, an ice cream parlor with a help wanted sign, the owner barely glanced at him. "We need someone who can work weekends," she said, already turning away. The surf shop was worse. The manager actually laughed. "Come back in a few years, kid." By the 6th rejection, Michael's throat felt tight. He found himself walking toward the cliffs automatically, seeking the comfort of his usual spot. The sun was already starting to set, painting everything gold. Rich people's cars lined the streets: Mercedes, BMWs, Teslas. A group of kids about his age walked past, carrying designer shopping bags and laughing about something on their phones. One of them wore shoes that probably cost more than his family's monthly rent. His own sneakers had holes in the sides, the soles worn paper-thin. Dad had bought them for his 12th birthday, a few months before he left. They didn't fit right anymore, But new shoes weren't exactly a priority. From the cliff path, Michael could see into some of the backyards of the mansion-lined street. Swimming pools glittered like jewels. Garden parties were in full swing. Waiters in white jackets carrying trays of food that probably cost more than their weekly grocery budget. The Thompson mansion stood apart from the others, its architecture more old-money elegant than flashy. The gardens were immaculate, but there were no parties here, no signs of life except for a nurse leaving through the front gate. Michael had read about Mr. Thompson's condition in the local paper. Early-stage Alzheimer's, the article said. The great philanthropist was stepping back from public life, his children taking over the foundation's day-to-day operations. Moving closer to his usual spot, Michael noticed something odd. The back door of the Thompson mansion stood open. A figure appeared, Mr. Thompson himself, dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt that looked slightly rumpled, unusual for a man known for his immaculate appearance. The old man walked with uncertain steps into his garden. His head turned from side to side as if looking for something, but his movements seemed random, confused. He moved past the garden's boundary, toward the public path that ran along the cliffs. Michael's hand tightened on his backpack strap. Something wasn't right. He'd seen his grandmother get confused like this near the end. The aimless wandering, the disorientation. Mr. Thompson stumbled slightly on the uneven ground. No one else seemed to notice. The garden parties continued at the neighboring houses, music and laughter floating on the evening breeze. The old man kept walking, moving closer to the cliff's edge. Michael's heart began to beat faster. Should he say something? Do something? But who would listen to him? A black kid from the wrong side of town, telling them something was wrong with their beloved billionaire. His phone buzzed. Mom's face appeared on the cracked screen. The eviction notice felt heavy in his backpack, like it was made of lead instead of paper. He should answer, should head home, should... Mr. Thompson took another unsteady step toward the edge. Michael's fingers hovered over the phone screen. The sun was setting. The wind was picking up, and an old man who had given millions to help people like him was walking toward a deadly drop, completely alone. The phone kept buzzing as Michael made his choice. The consequences would have to wait. Right now, someone needed help, even if they didn't know it yet. Even if helping them might mean putting himself at risk. Michael stepped forward, his worn sneakers silent on the familiar rocks, moving toward a moment that would change everything, for better or worse. Mr. Thompson stood at the edge of his property, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. His white hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and his expensive clothes hung loose on his frame, like he'd lost weight recently. His eyes darted around, unfocused and confused. "Mr. Thompson?" Michael called out softly, not wanting to startle him. The old man didn't respond. Instead, he took another step toward the cliff's edge, his leather shoes crunching on loose gravel. Michael's heart hammered in his chest. He was maybe 50 feet away, too far to reach the man if he fell. The drop behind Mr. Thompson was easily 70 feet, straight down to the rocks and churning water below. "Sir," he tried again, louder this time. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me?" The wind carried his voice away. In the nearby mansions, music played and people laughed, completely unaware of the drama unfolding on their doorstep. A seagull screamed overhead, the sound making Mr. Thompson look up sharply. Michael took a few careful steps forward, his mind racing. What would his grandmother have done? She'd worked in a nursing home before she got sick. She knew how to handle confused elderly people. "Stay calm," she'd always said. "They can sense when you're scared or nervous." But his hands were shaking, and his mouth felt dry. He was just a kid from Logan Heights. Who was he to approach one of the richest men in San Diego? Mr. Thompson turned suddenly, and Michael's heart nearly stopped. The old man's foot sent some pebbles skittering over the edge. They disappeared into the gathering darkness below. "I need to," Mr. Thompson muttered, his voice carrying on the wind. "The meeting. I'm late for the meeting." "Sir, there's no meeting," Michael said, taking another step forward. "You're at home. You're at La Jolla Cove." The old man's face creased in confusion. "Home? No. I have to. The board is waiting." He took another step backward, closer to the edge. The wind whipped his white hair around his face, and his balance wavered. Michael's mind flashed to the eviction notice in his backpack, to his mother working 2 jobs, to all the times he'd sat on these cliffs, watching the wealthy residents below and wondering why life was so unfair. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that a confused old man was about to walk off a cliff, and Michael was the only one who could stop it. "Look at me, Mr. Thompson," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Just look at me for a second." The old man's eyes finally focused on him, but there was no recognition there. Just confusion and a hint of fear. "Oh, who are you? What are you doing on my property?" Michael's throat tightened. This was what he'd been afraid of, a black teenager approaching a wealthy white man who wasn't in his right mind. Everything could go wrong in so many ways. "I'm Michael," he said softly. "I'm here to help you. So you're too close to the edge." "Edge?" Mr. Thompson glanced behind him, and for a moment, clarity seemed to flash across his face. But then the confusion returned, deeper than before. No, I have to get to the meeting. They're waiting." He turned again, and this time his foot slipped on the loose gravel. Michael's heart leaped into his throat as the old man windmilled his arms, trying to regain his balance. Time seemed to slow down. Michael saw everything with crystal clarity. The sharp rocks below, the darkening sky above, the distance between him and Mr. Thompson that suddenly seemed impossibly vast. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Sometimes God puts us in places for a reason, Michael. Sometimes we're exactly where we need to be." His feet started moving before his brain could catch up. The familiar rocks passed under his worn sneakers as he sprinted forward. All the hours he'd spent on these cliffs, all the paths he'd memorized, all led to this moment. Mr. Thompson swayed again, one foot sliding backward over the edge. His eyes were wide now, finally registering the danger, but it was too late for him to save himself. Michael ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. The wind roared in his ears. His legs burned. His lungs felt like they were on fire. 20 feet away. 15. 10. Mr. Thompson's arms flailed as he lost his balance completely. His body started to tilt backward, gravity taking hold. 5 feet. Michael launched himself forward, hands outstretched, everything else falling away except the need to reach this one confused old man who had wandered too close to the edge. Their fingers were inches apart now. The sun disappeared below the horizon, plunging everything into purple twilight. Below them, the waves crashed against the cliffs with a sound like thunder. This was the moment. This was the choice. Michael made it. Michael's fingers closed around Mr. Thompson's wrist just as the old man's feet left the ground. The momentum yanked Michael forward, his chest slamming against the rocky ground. Pain shot through his body, but he held on. "I've got you," he gasped, his other hand scrambling for purchase on the rough stone. "Don't move." Mr. Thompson's weight pulled at his arm, threatening to drag them both over. The old man thrashed in confusion, his expensive loafers kicking at empty air. "Let go!" Mr. Thompson shouted, his voice high with panic. "Who are you? Help! Someone help!" "Please, Mr. Thompson," Michael grunted, his muscles screaming. "I'm trying to help you. Just stop moving." But the old man kept struggling, his confusion making him fight against his rescuer. Michael's worn sneakers scraped against the rock as he tried to brace himself. A sharp edge dug into his knee, and he felt something warm and wet soaking through his jeans' blood. "The meeting," Mr. Thompson muttered, still trying to pull away. "I have to get to the board meeting." Michael's shoulder felt like it was being torn from its socket. He couldn't pull the man up, not while he was thrashing like this. And if someone heard Mr. Thompson's shouts? "Sir, listen to me," Michael said, forcing his voice to stay calm like his grandmother had taught him. "Listen to my voice. There's no meeting today. You're at home, at La Jolla Cove. You were confused and walked too close to the edge." Something in his tone must have gotten through. Mr. Thompson's struggles weakened slightly. "Home?" The old man blinked, looking around with bewildered eyes. "But I don't." "That's right. You're home," Michael continued, even as his arms trembled with the strain. "I'm going to help you, but you need to stay still. Can you do that for me, sir?" Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, some of the panic leaving his face. I, I think I can. Good. Now, when I count to 3, I'm going to pull you up. But you have to help me. Push with your feet against the cliff. Okay. Another nod, more certain this time. 1. Michael took a deep breath, ignoring the burning in his muscles. 2. He shifted his grip, getting a better hold on Mr. Thompson's arm. 3. They moved together, Mr. Thompson pushing while Michael pulled with every ounce of strength he had. The old man's shoes scrabbled against the rock face, finding small footholds. Inch by inch, they made progress. Finally, Mr. Thompson's upper body cleared the edge. Michael grabbed his shirt with his free hand and gave one final heave. They collapsed on a solid ground, both gasping for air. For a moment, they just lay there, the reality of what had almost happened sinking in. The wind whipped around them, carrying the distant sounds of the garden parties that had continued, oblivious to the near tragedy. Michael's knee throbbed where he'd hit it on the rocks. His shoulders ached, and his hands were scraped raw. But they were alive. They were safe. Mr. Thompson sat up slowly, his previously immaculate clothes now dirty and torn. He stared at Michael with a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. You saved my life," he said quietly. Before Michael could respond, shouts came from the direction of the Thompson mansion. Flashlight beams cut through the growing darkness. "Dad!" A woman's voice, tight with worry. "Dad, where are you?" "Mr. Thompson." Deeper voices, security guards, probably. Michael's heart rate spiked again, but for a different reason now. How would this look? A black teenager from Logan Heights, alone on private property, with a confused elderly billionaire at twilight? He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to get out of there before things got worse. But his grandmother's voice echoed in his head again. Running away only makes you look guilty when you've done nothing wrong. Besides, Mr. Thompson was still disoriented. Michael couldn't leave him alone, not again. The flashlight beams grew closer. Mr. Thompson turned toward the voices, then back to Michael. For a moment, his eyes cleared completely. "Stay," he said, gripping Michael's arm with surprising strength. "Please. They need to know what you did." Michael swallowed hard and nodded. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his mom, worried sick by now. The eviction notice crinkled in his backpack, a reminder of all the problems waiting at home. But right now, all he could do was sit there on the cold rocks, his knee bleeding through his jeans, and wait for whatever came next. The flashlights found them. There were shouts of surprise, rushing footsteps, a woman's cry of relief. "Dad! Oh my God, Dad!" A well-dressed woman in her 40s ran toward them. Followed by 2 men in security uniforms, she dropped to her knees beside Mr. Thompson, checking him for injuries. "I'm okay, Sarah," Mr. Thompson said, his voice stronger now. Thanks to this young man, all eyes turned to Michael. He fought the urge to shrink away from their stares. "What happened?" the woman Sarah demanded. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Before Michael could answer, Mr. Thompson spoke again. "He saved my life. I was confused, wandered too close to the edge. He stopped me from falling." The security guards exchanged glances. One of them spoke into a radio, calling for medical assistance. "Is this true?" Sarah asked Michael, her face unreadable in the dim light. Michael nodded, wincing as he shifted his weight off his injured knee. "Yes, ma'am. I was on my usual spot up there when I saw him walking this way. He seemed confused, and I was worried." "Your usual spot?" One of the guards frowned. "You come here often?" "Leave him alone, John," Mr. Thompson said sharply, a hint of his old authority entering his voice. "If he hadn't been here." He trailed off, and Sarah's face paled as she realized how close they'd come to tragedy. More people were arriving now, medical personnel, more security, curious neighbors. Camera phones appeared, their flashes bright in the gathering darkness. Michael's phone buzzed again. This time he pulled it out. 10 missed calls from his mom. 3 from Mrs. Rodriguez. I should go," he said, trying to stand. His knee buckled, and he had to grab a rock to keep from falling. "You're hurt," Sarah said, noticing the blood on his jeans. "We need to have someone look at that." "No, really, I'm fine. My mom's waiting." "At least let us give you a ride home," she insisted. "And we need your name, your contact information." Michael hesitated. The thought of one of these expensive cars pulling up in front of his rundown apartment building made his stomach turn. But his knee was throbbing badly now, and he wasn't sure he could make it to the bus stop. Mr. Thompson reached out and took his hand, his grip surprisingly strong and steady. "Please," the old man said softly. "Let us help you, the way you helped me." The sincerity in his voice made Michael's throat tight. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." As the medical personnel helped them both toward the waiting vehicles, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. He just wasn't sure if it would be for better or worse. The eviction notice crinkled in his backpack with every step, a reminder that reality was waiting, regardless of what happened here tonight. But for now, he let himself be led toward the warmth and light of the Thompson mansion, leaving the dark cliffs behind. The Thompson mansion's kitchen was bigger than Michael's entire apartment. He sat on a leather stool at a marble island, watching as a paramedic cleaned and bandaged his knee. The wound wasn't as bad as it had felt, but his jeans were ruined, torn, and bloodstained. "Just a deep scrape," the paramedic said, taping down the last bandage. "Try to keep it clean and change the dressing daily." Michael nodded, too overwhelmed by his surroundings to speak. Everything in the kitchen gleamed: stainless steel appliances, crystal glasses in glass-fronted cabinets, a wine collection that probably cost more than his mom would make in 10 years. In the adjacent living room, he could hear Mr. Thompson talking with his daughter Sarah, and what sounded like a doctor. The old man's voice was clearer now, more like the confident philanthropist Michael had seen on TV. "I'm fine, really," Mr. Thompson was saying. "Just got a bit turned around, that's all." "Dad, you almost walked off a cliff," Sarah's voice cracked. "If that boy hadn't been there—" Michael's phone buzzed again. His mom's text messages were getting increasingly frantic. "Where are you?" "Called Mrs. Rodriguez. She hasn't seen you in hours." "Please call me." His fingers hovered over the keys. But what could he say? "Sorry, Mom. Was busy saving a billionaire." "Michael." Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Your mother's on her way. We sent a car to pick her up." His stomach dropped. "You didn't have to dash." "Of course we did." She sat down across from him, her expensive perfume mixing with the antiseptic smell from his bandages. "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to talk about what happened." Outside the kitchen windows, camera flashes flickered. News vans had started arriving, their satellite dishes visible over the garden wall. "How did they find out so fast?" Michael asked. Sarah sighed. "Someone posted a video. It's already going viral. Black teen saves billionaire. The press is having a field day." Michael's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about phones recording everything, about how this would look to the outside world. Would people believe him? Or would they assume? "Young man," Mr. Thompson appeared in the doorway, supported by a nurse, but looking more like himself. He'd changed into clean clothes, his white hair neatly combed. "We need to discuss your reward." "Reward?" Michael blinked. "No, sir, I don't need dash nonsense." Mr. Thompson waved off his protest. "You saved my life. That deserves more than just a thank you." Before Michael could respond, commotion erupted at the front of the house. He heard his mother's voice, tight with worry and a hint of anger. "Where is my son?" "Michael?" He tried to stand, but his knee protested. Sarah moved to help him, just as his mom burst into the kitchen, still wearing her cleaning uniform from her second job. Her eyes were wild with fear until she saw him. "Michael!" She rushed forward, pulling him into a tight hug. "Baby, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Mom." He mumbled into her shoulder, suddenly feeling like a little kid again. "Really?" "Mrs. Wilson." Sarah stepped forward. "Please let us explain." Over the next 20 minutes, they told the story. Michael watched his mother's face cycle through emotions: fear, pride, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite read. When they described how close Mr. Thompson had come to falling, she grabbed Michael's hand and didn't let go. "Your son is a hero," Mr. Thompson said firmly, "and he must be rewarded appropriately." "We don't need dash," Michael's mom started, but the old man cut her off. "Sarah, get my checkbook." "Dad," Sarah said gently, "maybe we should discuss this tomorrow, when everyone's had a chance to rest." But Mr. Thompson's face set in familiar stubborn lines that Michael recognized from his grandmother. "No, it has to be now, before I get confused again." The room went quiet. Even the paramedics and security guards looked away, embarrassed by this acknowledgement of the great man's condition. Young Michael, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice strong and clear. You were exactly where you needed to be today. Not just by chance, but because you've been watching over these cliffs, and by extension, watching over me for months now. Haven't you? Michael nodded slowly. Yes, sir, I come here most days after school. Why? The question caught him off guard. He glanced at his mom, saw her squeeze his hand encouragingly. My grandmother used to bring me here, he said quietly. Before she died, she taught me about the cliffs, about fishing. And after she was gone, it felt like home somehow. Mr. Thompson nodded, as if this confirmed something for him. Sarah, the checkbook. His daughter sighed, but retrieved a leather-bound checkbook from a drawer. Mr. Thompson took it, along with the pen Sarah offered. Now, he said, looking directly at Michael, I've given millions to this city over the years. Built libraries, funded schools, established scholarships. But none of that matters if we don't recognize and reward true courage when we see it. He began writing, his hand steady despite everything that had happened. Michael's mom started to protest again, but Mr. Thompson held up his hand. Mrs. Wilson, please. Let me do this. Not just for Michael, but for myself. For once, I want to know my money is going to exactly the right place. He finished writing and held out the check. Sarah gasped when she saw the amount. Dad, that's Dash. Exactly right, he said firmly. $10 million. Michael felt his mother's hand tighten on his. The room spun slightly. Mr. Thompson, his mom's voice shook. We can't possibly, Dash. You can and you will. He handed her the check. Put it in a trust for Michael's education if you want. Buy a house. Start a business. The only condition is that you use it to make your lives better. Michael stared at the check in his mother's trembling hands. More money than he could even imagine. Enough to change everything. Outside, camera flashes continued to light up the windows. Reporters shouted questions at the security guards. Somewhere in the house, phones were ringing constantly. But in the kitchen, time seemed to stand still as Michael's mom looked down at the check, then at her son, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Mr. Thompson reached out and took Michael's free hand. No, he said softly. Thank you. For being where you needed to be. For doing what needed to be done. For being the kind of person who sees someone in trouble and helps without thinking about reward or consequences. His eyes cleared again, and for a moment, he was fully present. Promise me something, Michael. Promise me you'll keep watching over these cliffs. They need people like you, people who understand their strength and their danger. Will you do that? Michael nodded, his own eyes burning. Yes, sir, I promise. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. The press is getting aggressive. We should get you two home before this gets any crazier. Michael's mom folded the check carefully and put it in her purse, her hands still shaking slightly. What do we do next? Our lawyer will contact you tomorrow, Sarah said. We'll help set everything up, the trust, the taxes, whatever you need. She looked at Michael and smiled. Your life is going to change quite a bit. Are you ready for that? Michael thought about the eviction notice in his backpack, about his mom's 2 jobs and her high blood pressure, about his worn-out sneakers and the twins' need for new clothes. Yeah, he said softly. I think I am. As they were led toward a back exit where a car waited to take them home, Michael heard Mr. Thompson say one last thing to his daughter. Sarah, make sure he gets a new pair of shoes. A boy who saves lives shouldn't have holes in his sneakers. Michael smiled, feeling the weight of the past few hours finally settling on his shoulders. He was exhausted, his knee hurt, and tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't even imagine. But for now, he had his mom's hand in his, a future suddenly full of possibilities, and a promise to keep to an old man who had given him far more than just money. The cliffs would be waiting for him tomorrow. They always would be. The police were waiting at Michael's apartment when they arrived. 2 patrol cars sat outside the building, their lights casting red and blue shadows across the cracked concrete. Officers stood talking to Mrs. Rodriguez, who still had Marcus and Maya clinging to her sides. Michael, the twins shouted in unison, breaking away from their neighbor and running toward him. Careful, his mom said as they crashed into him. Your brother's hurt his knee. A young officer approached them, notebook in hand. Michael Wilson? I'm Officer Chun. We need to take your statement about what happened at the Thompson property. Michael's mom stepped forward. Can't this wait until morning? He's exhausted. Ma'am, given the high-profile nature of the incident, it's okay, Mom, Michael said quietly. Let's just get it over with. They sat in their small living room, the furniture suddenly looking shabbier than ever under the officer's scrutiny. Michael told the story again, trying to remember every detail. Officer Chin took notes while his partner recorded the conversation on his phone. And you're often in that area? Officer Chin asked. On private property? Michael's mom tensed beside him. The cliffs are public access. Parts of them, the officer corrected. But the section near the Thompson estate is where I saved Mr. Thompson's life, Michael finished, his voice stronger than he felt. He didn't seem to mind. Officer Chin's partner smiled slightly at that. No, I suppose he didn't. More questions followed. Yes, he often went to the cliffs. No, he'd never been in trouble with the law. Yes, he understood the media attention this would receive. Speaking of media, Officer Chin said, you should know there are reporters gathering outside. We're keeping them back. But Michael's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Need comment on Thompson rescue. NBC San Diego. Another buzz. Another unknown number. His mom took the phone gently from his hands. No more tonight. He's done. The officers finally left, but not before warning them about talking to the press or posting on social media. As if Michael had any interest in either right now. Mrs. Rodriguez brought the twins back inside, her eyes wide with excitement. Mi hijo, you're a hero. It's all over the news already. She pulled out her phone, showing them a local news website. There it was at the top of the page. Teen hero saves billionaire from cliff fall. Someone had managed to take a photo of Michael being helped toward the Thompson mansion, his jeans bloody, Mr. Thompson's daughter supporting him. The video's going viral too, Mrs. Rodriguez continued. Twitter, TikTok, everything. What video? Michael asked, his stomach dropping. She showed him. Someone at one of the neighboring houses had recorded the aftermath of the rescue. Michael and Mr. Thompson on the ground. The arrival of security and medical personnel. The quality was poor in the dim light, but you could clearly hear Mr. Thompson saying, he saved my life. 2 million views already, Mrs. Rodriguez said proudly. The twins bounced around excitedly. Our brother's famous. Marcus shouted. Can we watch it again? Maya begged. No, their mom said firmly. It's way past bedtime. Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for watching them. And for everything else. After their neighbor left, Mom herded the twins toward their room. Brush your teeth. No arguments. When she returned, she found Michael still staring at his phone, now turned off to stop the constant buzzing. You okay, baby? He looked up at her. Are you? She sat beside him on their worn couch, pulling out the check from her purse. They both stared at it. $10 million, she whispered. It doesn't seem real. What are we going to do? She took a deep breath. First, we're going to get some sleep. Tomorrow, we'll talk to the lawyer Miss Thompson promised to send. We'll do this, right? Michael nodded. The eviction notice is not a problem anymore. She squeezed his hand. You don't have to worry about that stuff now. People are going to talk. At school, in the neighborhood. Let them talk. She touched his cheek gently. You did something brave and good, Michael. Don't let anyone make you feel different about that. A car honked outside, followed by shouted questions, more reporters arriving. We should go stay with Aunt Joyce in National City, Michael suggested. Just until this dies down. His mom shook her head. No running away. This is our home. And you heard what Mr. Thompson asked you to promise. To keep watching over those cliffs. Yeah, but a knock at the door made them both jump. Michael's mom went to check the peephole, then quickly opened the door. A tall man in an expensive suit stood there, flanked by two others who screamed security in their stance and attire. Mrs. Wilson? I'm James Morton, head of security for the Thompson family. May I come in? She stepped aside, and the men entered their small living room. Mr. Morton looked oddly out of place among their second-hand furniture. The media presence is going to increase, he said without preamble. We'd like to provide security for you and your family for the next few days, until things calm down. Michael's mom straightened her back. "We can't afford Dash. This is courtesy of the Thompson family," Mr. Morton interrupted smoothly. "2 guards on rotation, 24/7. They'll keep the press away. Escort Michael 2 in from school if needed, whatever you require." He handed her a card. "My direct number. Call anytime, day or night, if you need anything." "The check," Michael's mom said suddenly. "Should we deposit it tonight? Is it safe here?" Mr. Morton smiled slightly. "The bank's been notified. Everything's arranged for tomorrow morning. For tonight, just try to rest. We'll handle the chaos outside." After he left, placing the guards at their door, Michael's mom sank onto the couch. "This is really happening," she whispered. Michael's knee throbbed as he shifted position. "Are we going to be okay?" She pulled him close, kissing the top of his head like she used to when he was little. "We're going to be better than okay. But right now, you need sleep." Later, lying in his bed, Michael could still hear activity outside. Cars arriving and leaving, muffled voices, the occasional camera flash through his window blinds. His phone lay silent on his nightstand, turned off to stop the constant messages. His ruined jeans hung over his chair, a reminder that this wasn't just some crazy dream. Somewhere across town, in his massive mansion, Mr. Thompson was probably sleeping too, safe because a kid from Logan Heights had been in the right place at the right time. Michael touched his bandaged knee gently. It hurt, but not as much as before. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and banks and reporters, and who knew what else. His life had changed forever in a single moment on those cliffs. But for now, in the darkness of his room, Michael smiled. His mom didn't have to work 2 jobs anymore. They wouldn't lose their home. The twins could get new clothes, better food, maybe even go to a good school. And he had a promise to keep, to watch over the cliffs that had given him so much. Outside, a reporter shouted another question, quickly silenced by the guards. Michael rolled over, pulling his thin blanket tighter around him. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight, he just needed to sleep. The last thing he thought about before drifting off wasn't the money or the fame or the changes ahead. It was the look in Mr. Thompson's eyes when he'd made that promise, clear and strong and certain, a moment of perfect clarity in a mind that was slowly slipping away. Some promises, Michael realized, were worth keeping no matter what came next. Dawn brought a surreal scene to the Wilsons' apartment complex. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metal flowers. Reporters clutched coffee cups in the morning chill, watching the building's entrance where 2 Thompson security guards stood like statues. Michael sat at their small kitchen table, still in his pajamas, watching his mom talk on the phone. She'd been up since 5, fielding calls from family members who'd seen the news. "Yes, Aunt Joyce, it's real," she said for what seemed like the 100th time. "No, we're not moving yet. We need to figure things out first." The twins were glued to the living room TV, watching the news coverage of last night's events. Their own building kept appearing in the background of live shots, making them squeal with excitement each time. "That's our house," Marcus shouted. "Look, there's Mr. Morton." The Thompson family's head of security was indeed outside, directing his team as they managed the media circus. More guards had arrived at dawn, setting up a perimeter around the building. Michael's phone, freshly turned on, hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from classmates, teachers, strangers who'd somehow got his number. He ignored them all, focusing instead on the text from Sarah Thompson. "Car arriving at 9 a.m. to take you to the bank. Then meeting with lawyers at our office. We're something comfortable. Long day ahead." His mom hung up the phone with a sigh. "Your Aunt Joyce wants us to move to National City with her." "What did you tell her?" "That we need time to think." She looked at the TV, where a reporter was interviewing their neighbors about the hero next door. The doorbell rang. One of the guards called through the door. "Mrs. Wilson? The Thompson car is here early." Michael's mom smoothed her dress, one of her best, usually reserved for church. "Ready?" He looked down at his new clothes, bought hastily last night through an emergency delivery service Mr. Morton had arranged. The jeans felt stiff, the shoes too clean. "I guess." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at their door to watch the twins. She hugged Michael tightly. "Mi hero," she whispered. "Show them what Logan Heights is made of." The journey down to the waiting car felt like walking a gauntlet. Reporters shouted questions. "Michael, how does it feel to be a hero?" "Mrs. Wilson, What are you going to do with the money? Is it true Mr. Thompson offered you a job? The guards formed a tight circle around them, clearing a path to a black SUV with tinted windows. Michael caught glimpses of neighbors filming on their phones, younger kids pointing and whispering. Inside the car, the silence felt heavy. A partition separated them from the driver, giving them privacy. "You okay?" his mom asked softly. Michael nodded, watching his neighborhood slide past the windows. Everything looked different somehow, like a movie set of his life, rather than the real thing. The bank was downtown, a towering glass building Michael had passed 100 times on the bus, but never entered. They were escorted through a private entrance to a conference room where a team of people in suits waited. "Mrs. Wilson, Michael." A woman stepped forward, hand extended. "I'm Patricia Chun, your new financial advisor. The Thompsons asked me to help manage your gift." Gift? They kept using that word, like Mr. Thompson had given them a birthday card instead of enough money to change their lives forever. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of signatures and explanations. Trust funds, investment strategies, tax implications. Michael watched his mom's face grow more overwhelmed with each new document. "Perhaps we should take a break," Ms. Chun suggested, noticing their expressions. "This is a lot to process." "No," Michael's mom said firmly. "We need to do this right. Keep going." The final paper his mom signed established a trust for Michael's education and future. The rest of the money would be managed by Ms. Chen's team, with monthly disbursements to cover their immediate needs. "The first priority," Ms. Chen said, "is finding you a new house. Something safer with better security. The media attention won't die down quickly." Michael's mom gripped his hand under the table. "We don't need anything fancy. Just something stable. Of course. We'll start looking this afternoon if you'd like." The Thompson family's office occupied the top floor of another glass tower. Sarah met them in the lobby, looking fresh despite the early hour. "How are you holding up?" she asked Michael. "Okay. Just tired." She smiled sympathetically. "Dad's been asking for you. He's having a good day?" "Very clear. Would you like to see him?" Michael looked at his mom, who nodded encouragingly. Mr. Thompson sat in a sunny office, looking more like himself than he had last night. He stood when they entered, moving with the confidence of the businessman he'd been for decades. "Michael, Mrs. Wilson, please sit." They settled into leather chairs that probably cost more than their old car. Mr. Thompson studied Michael for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "I've spent my life trying to help this city. Built libraries, funded schools, created jobs. But I always did it from a distance. Wrote checks, attended ceremonies, smiled for photos." He leaned forward slightly. "What you did yesterday, that was real help. Immediate. Personal. You saw someone in trouble and acted, without thinking about reward or consequences. Anyone would have done the same," Michael mumbled. "No." Mr. Thompson's voice was firm. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have called for help, filmed it on their phones, waited for someone else to act. You didn't wait. That's rare, Michael. That's special." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small box. "Sarah told me about your grandmother, how she taught you about the cliffs." Michael's throat tightened. "Yes, sir, this was my father's." Mr. Thompson opened the box, revealing an old compass, its brass case worn smooth by years of handling. "He taught me about those cliffs too, back when La Jolla was more wild than wealthy. I want you to have it." "Sir, I can't dash. You can and you will." He held out the box. "Money comes and goes, Michael. But this is about legacy. About knowing where you come from and where you're going." Michael took the box with trembling hands. The compass felt warm, alive with history. "I won't be around much longer," Mr. Thompson continued quietly. "Not as myself, anyway. This disease." He tapped his temple. "It's taking things from me, day by day. But I want you to remember me as I am right now, giving you this compass and telling you that you have a gift. Not the money. That's just paper. Your gift is seeing what needs to be done and doing it, no matter the cost." Tears pricked at Michael's eyes. His mom wiped her own away silently. "The cliffs will always be there," Mr. Thompson said. "And now you have something to help you find your way back to them, no matter where life takes you." A knock at the door. "Sarah," reminding them of more meetings waiting. "One more thing," Mr. Thompson said as they stood to leave. The foundation is establishing a scholarship program for Logan Heights students. The Michael Wilson Scholarship Fund. You'll help us choose the recipients each year. Michael stared at him. But I'm just a kid. Mr. Thompson smiled, and for a moment, his eyes were as clear as the morning sky outside. You stopped being just anything the moment you chose to help a confused old man who'd wandered too close to the edge. Remember that, Michael. Remember who you are. Outside the office, in the hallway, Michael opened the compass box again. The needle spun briefly before settling, pointing unerringly north. His mom touched his shoulder. You okay? He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Ahead lay more meetings, more decisions, more changes. But for now, Michael held a piece of history in his hands, given to him by a man who saw something in him that he was only beginning to see in himself. The compass needle trembled slightly like it was alive, pointing the way forward, just as his grandmother had once taught him to find his way home from the cliffs. Some gifts, Michael realized, were worth far more than money. 1 month after the rescue, Michael sat in Ms. Chen's office, listening to her explain investment portfolios. The financial advisor had insisted on weekly meetings, teaching him about money management even though he was only 13. Your mother's business plan looks solid, Ms. Chen said, shuffling through papers on her desk. Opening a cleaning service of her own instead of working for others. It's a smart move. Michael nodded, fidgeting with the compass in his pocket. He carried it everywhere now, a reminder of that day on the cliffs. And how are you settling into the new house? They'd moved 2 weeks ago, not to La Jolla or any other fancy neighborhood, but to a modest house in a safer part of Logan Heights. His mom had been firm about staying in the community. It's good, Michael said. The twins love having their own rooms, and the security situation. The media frenzy had died down somewhat, but photographers still followed him occasionally. The Thompson family's security team remained on call, though they'd scaled back their visible presence. Better. School's almost normal now. That wasn't entirely true. His classmates treated him differently, some with awe, others with resentment. Teachers who'd barely noticed him before now praised his every answer. The principal had even asked him to speak at assembly about heroism and community values. Ms. Chen closed her laptop. There's something else we need to discuss. The Thompson Foundation board meeting is next week. As a scholarship fund advisor, you'll need to dash. A knock interrupted her. Sarah Thompson entered, looking apologetic. Sorry to interrupt. Michael, Dad's asking for you. He's having a very clear day, and he wants to go to the cliffs. Michael sat up straighter. Now, if you're free. The doctors say fresh air might help, and he specifically requested you as his companion. Ms. Chun smiled. I think we're done here. Go on, Michael. The ride to La Jolla was quiet. Mr. Thompson sat beside Michael in the back of the car, looking more frail than he had a month ago, but still dignified in his casual clothes. Thank you for coming, the old man said. Some days, everything's foggy. But today I remember everything. And I wanted to see it again with you. They parked in the Thompson Estate's private drive. Security guards kept their distance as Michael helped Mr. Thompson along the path to the cliffs. Careful, sir, Michael said, remembering that day. The rocks are uneven here. Mr. Thompson chuckled. You sound like my nurses. He patted the hand Michael had placed supportively under his elbow. But I trust you know these cliffs better than anyone now. They reached a bench overlooking the cove. The late afternoon sun painted the water gold, just like it had that day. How's your mother's business going? Mr. Thompson asked as they sat. Good. She hired Mrs. Rodriguez and 2 other ladies from the neighborhood. They already have contracts with 3 office buildings downtown. Excellent. And the twins? Sarah mentioned they're starting at the prep school next semester. Michael nodded. Mom insisted they take the entrance exams. They both got scholarships, even without the fund. Mr. Thompson smiled proudly. Intelligence runs in your family, as does determination. They watched the waves crash below. A group of tourists took photos nearby, not recognizing them. The compass, Mr. Thompson said suddenly. Do you have it? Michael pulled it from his pocket. The brass had grown warmer with constant handling, developing a deeper patina. My father gave that to me when I was about your age, Mr. Thompson said, touching it gently. Said a man needs to know where he's going, but more importantly, needs to know where he comes from. I take it everywhere, Michael admitted. Good. Because things are going to change more, Michael. That's what money does. It changes things. Not always for the better. Michael thought about the kids at school who used to ignore him, but now wanted to be his best friend. About the neighbors who asked for loans or investments in their business ideas. I'm learning that, he said quietly. But that compass, it'll help you remember who you are. Where you come from? Mr. Thompson's voice grew softer. Some days, I can't remember what I had for breakfast. But I remember that day on these cliffs. Remember your voice, keeping me calm, your strength, pulling me back. He turned to face Michael fully. Money comes with responsibility. The scholarship fund, that's just the start. I've made arrangements. Sarah will explain everything when the time comes. But I need to know you understand what I'm trusting you with. Sir? My legacy, Michael. Not just the money or the foundation, but the responsibility to see what needs doing and do it. To help others find their way back from the edge, whatever that edge might be. Michael gripped the compass tighter. I understand. Mr. Thompson nodded, satisfied. They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower. I'd like to come back tomorrow, Mr. Thompson said finally. Will you come with me? Michael heard the unspoken truth. That tomorrow, Mr. Thompson might not remember this conversation or even who Michael was. The disease was progressing faster now, stealing more moments each day. Of course, sir, whenever you want. That evening, Michael sat with his family in their new kitchen. His mom stirred a pot of her famous gumbo while discussing business plans with Mrs. Rodriguez. The twins did homework at the counter, their new school uniforms still stiff with newness. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah Thompson. Dad talked about your cliff visit all evening. Thank you. Michael touched the compass in his pocket. The needle pointed north, steady and sure, just like his grandmother had taught him. Just like Mr. Thompson trusted him to be. Michael, his mom called. Can you run to the store? We need more rice. Sure. He stood, keys to their new car jangling in his pocket alongside the compass. Take one of the guards, she reminded him. Just in case? He nodded, understanding now that their new life came with both privileges and precautions. But as he drove to the store in their modest sedan, not the luxury car the Thompsons had offered, he felt centered, grounded. The money had changed things, yes, but the important things remained constant. His mom's strength, the twins' laughter, Mrs. Rodriguez's fierce loyalty, and the lessons his grandmother had taught him about finding his way home. And now he had new constants too. Mr. Thompson's trust, Sarah's guidance, Miss Chin's patient teachings about responsibility and planning for the future. The compass sat heavy in his pocket. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable gifts aren't the ones that come with lots of zeros attached. When he got back home, the twins were arguing about math homework. His mom was on the phone with a potential client, and Mrs. Rodriguez was setting the table for dinner. Normal life, just in a slightly different setting. Michael smiled, putting the rice away in their new pantry. Tomorrow, he'd sit with Mr. Thompson on the cliffs again, whether the old man remembered him or not. He'd listen to the waves crash below and watch the sun paint the water gold. And he'd remember that sometimes the biggest changes in life come not from what you gain, but from what you choose to hold on to. 3 months after the rescue, Michael stood at his usual spot on the cliffs, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The worn brass compass sat warm in his palm, its needle pointing steadily north. I thought I'd find you here. He turned to see Sarah Thompson walking carefully along the path. She looked tired. The past week had been hard on everyone. How are you holding up? She asked, joining him at the edge. Okay. Michael closed the compass. How's your dad today? Better. The new medication helps with the confusion. He asked about you this morning. Wanted to know if you were still watching over his cliffs. Michael smiled slightly. Even on his worst days, Mr. Thompson somehow remembered the cliffs and the promise Michael had made to watch over them. The first scholarship committee meeting is tomorrow, Sarah said. Are you ready? The Michael Wilson Scholarship Fund had grown beyond its initial scope. What started as a program for Logan Heights students had expanded to cover 5 underserved neighborhoods. Tomorrow, they would select the first 50 recipients. I think so. Mom helped me review all the applications. Sarah nodded approvingly. How is her business going? Really good. They just signed contracts with 2 more office buildings. Mrs. Rodriguez is training new staff next week. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the waves crash below. The past 3 months had changed everything, yet somehow nothing at all. They still lived in Logan Heights, just in a better house. His mom still worked hard, just for herself now instead of others. The twins still bickered over homework, just at a better school. And Michael still came to the Cliffs every day, keeping his promise. Dad wants to make an announcement, Sarah said finally. About the foundation, Michael turned to her. Is he well enough? He has good days and bad days. But he's clear about this. He wants you on the board, the youngest member in its history. But I'm just Dash. If you say, just a kid, I'm going to remind you of what you did right here 3 months ago. Sarah's voice was firm but kind. Dad trusts you, Michael. Not just with his life, but with his legacy. A gust of wind whipped around them, carrying the salt smell of the ocean. 3 months ago, a similar wind had nearly cost Mr. Thompson his life. When? Michael asked. Next week. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. She smiled. Your family now, you know. All of you? Michael thought about the weekly dinners at the Thompson mansion, where his mom traded business advice with Sarah while the twins played in the garden. About Mr. Thompson's clear days, when he would tell stories about the Cliffs and teach Michael about responsibility and legacy. There's something else, Sarah continued. Dad's established a trust, separate from the scholarship fund. It's for you, but not just money this time. He's leaving you this. She gestured to the cliffs around them. What do you mean? This whole stretch of coastline, he's owned it for years. Kept developers away, preserved it in its natural state. The trust will continue that work, with you as its guardian. Michael's hand tightened around the compass. But why me? Because you understand what these cliffs mean, what they represent. Sarah touched his shoulder gently. Dad says you see them the way he did when he was young. Not as property to be developed, but as something wild and valuable that needs protection. Tears pricked at Michael's eyes. He thought about his grandmother teaching him to fish here, about Mr. Thompson's confused wandering that fateful day, about all the hours he'd spent watching the waves crash below. I won't let him down, he said quietly. He knows that. We all do. A notification buzzed on Sarah's phone. The nurses say Dad's asking for you. He wants to watch the sunset from the garden. Will you come? Michael nodded, taking one last look at the darkening horizon. They walked together toward the Thompson mansion, where lights were starting to twinkle on in the windows. Mr. Thompson sat in his favorite garden chair, a blanket over his legs despite the mild evening. His face lit up when he saw Michael. Ah, there's my young friend. Sarah? Did you tell him? Yes, Dad. All of it. The old man beckoned Michael closer. Show me the compass, son. Michael pulled it from his pocket, placing it in Mr. Thompson's trembling hands. Still working perfectly, I see. Mr. Thompson smiled. You know, some people think compasses just point north. But they do more than that. They help you find your way home. His eyes were clear tonight, focused and sharp. These cliffs have been my home since I was younger than you. I protected them, watched over them. Now it's your turn. I won't let you down, sir. I know you won't. Mr. Thompson handed back the compass. Because you already understand what took me years to learn. That true wealth isn't in bank accounts or business deals. It's in knowing who you are and where you come from. They watched the last rays of sun disappear behind the horizon. In the distance, waves continued their endless dance with the cliffs. My father gave me that compass, Mr. Thompson said softly, and told me to find my way in the world. I gave it to you because you already know your way. You proved that the day you saved my life. He reached out and gripped Michael's hand with surprising strength. Promise me something else, Michael. Promise you'll teach others what you know about the cliffs, about doing what's right, about finding their way home. I promise. Later that night, back in their new house, Michael sat with his mom on their back porch. The twins were asleep, their new school uniforms laid out for tomorrow. Mrs. Rodriguez had left after dinner, but not before making Michael promise to tell her everything about the foundation announcement next week. You okay, baby? His mom asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Michael pulled out the compass, watching its needle swing steadily north. Yeah, Just thinking about everything that's changed. And everything that hasn't? He smiled. She always knew what he was thinking. The money, the foundation, the cliffs, it's a lot of responsibility, he said. His mom took his hand, her fingers strong and sure, the hands that had held their family together through the hardest times. You know what I think? I think God puts us where we need to be, when we need to be there. Just like you were on those cliffs that day. Michael thought about Mr. Thompson's words about legacy and responsibility, about Sarah's trust in him, about his grandmother's lessons about the cliffs and finding his way home. We're going to be okay, aren't we? He asked, though he already knew the answer. His mom squeezed his hand. We already are, baby. We already are. Tomorrow would bring more changes, scholarship meetings, foundation responsibilities, the constant balance of his new life with the old. But tonight, sitting with his mom under the stars, Michael felt the compass warm in his pocket and knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The cliffs would be waiting for him tomorrow, as they always had been. But now they were more than just his refuge. They were his responsibility, his legacy, his way of keeping a promise to a man who had given him far more than money. Some gifts, after all, were worth more than all the money in the world. Like knowing who you are, like knowing where you come from, like having a compass to guide you home, no matter how far life takes you. Michael opened the compass one last time, its needle pointing unerringly north. In the distance, waves crashed against the cliffs, their endless rhythm a reminder that some things never change, even when everything else does. And that was exactly as it should be.